So now is my opportunity to give you the State of the Union address. I'm thrilled to be here with all of you, my fellow CFT leaders, all my union siblings, CFT and local union staff, and invited guests. This year's convention is a lot of firsts. It's my first State of the Union speech as CFT President, and my first time presiding as chair of the convention. This is our first biennial convention, which we approved in 2018 through a constitutional amendment by this very body. And this is the first ever virtual CFT convention. While we are making the best of the current circumstances, I sincerely hope it will be the last virtual convention. Moments spent together in the governance of our union and in the camaraderie of our work are the highlight of my work as the CFT President. I am so looking forward to the days when we can once again be together in person. I would be remiss were I not to address from the beginning the reason that we are not together in person this year. In March of 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic spread throughout the U.S., and life as we knew it changed virtually overnight. California, under the leadership of Governor Gavin Newsom, took the right approach and shut down as much as possible as quickly as possible. For us, that meant closing the doors to our schools and colleges to keep our school communities safe. But our courage and tenacity these last 12 months have been amazing, as many of the stories you've just heard. The way we have risen to the challenge, the way we are all pulled together to keep the school year going, the way we looked out for one another and for our school families have been the most inspiring experience of my professional career. Never before have I felt more profoundly there is power in the union. There have been many moments in the past several months when the public narrative about our profession has failed to acknowledge our significant contribution to not only the academic growth of California students, but to the socio-emotional health and their very physical safety. That failure of acknowledgement is especially true as we have advocated for the safest measures for in-person instruction, most critical in this moment of a global pandemic. And those are becoming reality, and we're starting to see those doors open and in-person education with those safest measures. To those who say we have not been providing an education to the students of California while teaching remotely, I hearken back to the words spoken by our own State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tony Thurmond, who said, "We didn't lose a year of school, we preserved life." And speaking of working remotely, who'd have thought a Zoom chat box would bring such important moments of friendship and consolation? All I know is that I have found solace and inspiration in the moments we've shared in a virtual environment and the late-night phone calls we've all had. I remember the layoff negotiations I attended with Carl Williams of Lawndale to let management know that the entire CFT was behind the members of that local, and then management rescinded those layoffs of those classified employees. I remember talking to Larissa Stewart from Rescue Union or Debbie Hopper from Sonora about their districts having in-person classes even before a vaccine and what we could do. I remember learning from Barbara Bear and Teresa Laughlin at Palomar and how they provided training to faculty members on remote learning so they could continue to provide educating their students. And I also remember the call from Gloria Garcia, president of 1475, to let me know that her members who were already back in person were finally able to secure vaccines through the support of our staff. All of these experiences were due to the pandemic. And there is a light at the end of the tunnel against COVID-19. As I was just saying, we now have multiple vaccines. And from our advocacy, we as essential workers were prioritized to get the vaccine. And now well over 600,000 school workers have received a first vaccine shot, and many of those are already fully vaccinated. Now, let me remind you, CFT was actually forged in the fire of the last pandemic this country experienced. This union was established in 1919 when the U.S. was still reeling from the effects of the 1918 flu pandemic. That national disaster did not stop us from coming together to chart a course for the future then, and it won't stop us now. As we did at the moment of our founding, we find ourselves at a moment to once again rise up, recover, and rebuild. While it can't be overstated that the COVID-19 pandemic has had a major impact on every single person in the world, there were other crises that we are all dealing with this past year. Our very democracy was under attack. We have endured 4 years of a presidential administration and a political party that has waged an unprecedented attack on our democracy. The insurrection on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th did not happen in a vacuum. That attack was a manifestation of years of simmering white supremacy that the former president brought out into the light, stoking the fires of racial hatred and mistrust of the government. The false narrative that he and his most ardent and vicious supporters continue to spread about the results of the 2020 presidential election is not simply the story of a single news cycle. Rather, it is an intentional effort to disenfranchise voters and prevent black and brown people, working people, and those in poverty from participating in our democracy. But we fought back and continued to rebuild our democracy. Whether it is the work that our former Secretary of State and now U.S. Senator Alex Padilla did here in California, or the heroic work that Stacey Abrams did in Georgia in the effort to expand to protect voting rights, the right to vote is one that must be protected and defended. And so we will continue, and we must continue to fight to protect that right to vote for all Americans. And in this fight to protect democracy, this past presidential election was one of the most important elections of our lifetime. And CFT members, and once again, went above and beyond the call to show up for that election and to bring sorely needed change to our country. Despite being in lockdown, CFT members and retirees made more phone calls to their fellow members than ever before. 75,000 calls, over 75,000 calls made. We called Arizona, Colorado, Florida, Nevada, and Wisconsin, and all critical swing states for the presidential election to help make sure that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were elected president and vice president of the United States, and we did it. And after doing all of that in November, we turned around and we did it again in December and January, joining the labor-fed phone banks and sending thousands of postcards to Georgia to help elect Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock to bring the Senate under Democratic control for the first time in years. I highlight this work that we did for these campaigns because, as we are already beginning to see, elections matter. After years of congressional gridlock and the horrors of the Trump administration, we are in a moment when we can begin to take action on the immense challenges that we face. No one election will solve our country's ills. We know that. And many of the crises that we address will take years to continue to address in a meaningful way, regardless of electoral politics, and we continue to organize on those issues separate from electoral politics. But it is undeniable that meeting the challenges of the moment and of the years to come will be different with a president who has already begun to demonstrate a commitment to working families, to unions, and to public education indeed. A president who is proud to be married to Dr. Jill Biden, a community college professor who is herself a member of a union. Another crisis that President Biden has taken action on so quickly is climate change. Thankfully, after years of climate denial in our federal government and a president who called climate change a hoax, President Biden has rejoined the Paris Agreement, named John Kerry as climate envoy, and the U.S. is once again part of the global community committed to tackling this crisis. Our union, too, is committed to being a part of addressing climate change. In fact, the CFT made history when it became the first statewide labor organization in the United States to adopt a climate justice agenda in 2016. Thanks to Jim Miller from San Diego leading our effort, he also is representing us on the AFT Climate Change Task Force. This very body, the delegates to the CFT Convention, passed a resolution committing the union to pushing for green legislation, moving towards divestment in fossil fuels, and educating members about climate change. There are clear reasons why the CFT is committed to being an active participant in the fight against climate change. Unions have long led the fight to protect workers on health, on the job, and at home. Climate change is increasingly putting workers and their families' health at risk with hotter temperatures, droughts, historic wildfires, extreme weather events, and more infectious disease, and worse air quality. And as educators, we have placed our bets on the future, and we believe that our interests are interwoven with the interests of our students and the communities we serve. Climate change threatens all of us, and those who cynically deny it are declaring war on the future. These crises, a pandemic, threat to democracy, climate change, on their own, they present challenges and responsibilities that demand the best from us. They demand us to work hard. However, the need to act with urgency becomes even more apparent, even more critical, when we acknowledge that there is one overarching crisis that has both engendered and exacerbated them all. And that is the profound racial inequality and injustice that is cemented in the very foundation of this country. Our country was born and built on the backs of enslaved Black people and Indigenous people. Most of us live on stolen Indigenous land, and the treatment of immigrants, from the days of the Chinese Exclusion Act to the current border crisis in which Mexican children are literally in cages, is part of our country, unfortunately. The dismantling of racist systems demand that we first acknowledge their existence from the very birth of this country, and only then can we begin our work. As John Lewis said, ours is not the struggle of one day, 1 week, or 1 year. Ours is not the struggle of one judicial appointment or presidential term. Ours is the struggle of a lifetime, maybe even many lifetimes. And each one of us, in every generation, must do our part. And I reply to John, we will do our part, we as CFT. In reflecting on the crisis that I've discussed here today, I believe that it is imperative that we address the ways in which systemic racism has made each one worse for the Black and brown and Indigenous members of our communities. The COVID-19 crisis has hit communities of color the hardest. In the United States, Hispanic people are 70% more likely than white people to become infected with the coronavirus. Black people are 50% more likely, and Native American people 80% more likely. And all three groups are dying from COVID-19 at nearly 3 times the rate of white people. The reasons for these rates of COVID are not a mystery. Black, brown, and Indigenous communities have higher rates of poverty, higher rates of incarceration, fewer options for health care, and are starved of resources to fight this virus. All of this stems from the centuries of systemic racism. The fight for the very soul of our democracy likewise is linked to America's failure to reckon with its racial past. Restricting voting rights to anyone who isn't a wealthy white person isn't a new tactic. Poll taxes and Jim Crow laws work to prevent Black people, especially from participating in our democracy. And the recent attempts at roll purging and disenfranchisement is continuation of that work, of what Stacey Abrams has called Jim Crow in the suit and tie. In fact, they just passed a law yesterday in Georgia to continue to do the disenfranchisement. Climate change, too, most impacts Black, brown, and Indigenous people and communities. While wealthy white lawmakers like Ted Cruz can seemingly opt out of both the conversation and the impacts of climate change and fly off to Cancun at the last hint of discomfort, communities of color around the world do not have that luxury and are demanding that global lawmakers and advocates that take this crisis seriously. Environmental justice advocates have long noted that Black, brown, and Indigenous communities are more likely to be affected by environmental factors like air pollution and toxic waste, and are more likely to live in areas that experience events like hurricanes, floods, and droughts. The fight for environmental justice cannot exist without the fight for racial justice. And understanding how hundreds of years of ignoring the disparities in our communities and the red lines that have been drawn along racial lines is a necessary starting point in the fight for climate change. For climate justice. In tracing the ways it impacts our current moment in a pandemic, our fight for our democracy, and our efforts to confront the climate crisis, it only becomes more clear that racism is a creature whose tentacles reach into every aspect of life in America. I know our union, the CFT, I know I myself will continue to use our privilege and be committed itself to attack this beast in ways that we as educators and unionists are best suited to do. While we have done some of the work on racial justice, we have much more to do. We must recommit to fight against racism. We will continue to work with our community partners and labor partners to protest racist acts, to pass police reform laws, to get ethnic studies in our classrooms, and to diversify the educators to reflect the communities of our state and much more. We need to take the next step and be more exacting and thoughtful in everything we do. If we do not have justice in our society, if we do not erase the systemic and institutional racism that exists, how do we eliminate poverty? How do we stop acts of hate? How do we end the prison pipeline? How do we end police brutality and murder? And how do we make the dream of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness a reality for everyone? We must be an anti-racist organization. We have seen overtly racist killings over the last several years, including by the very people who are supposed to serve and protect. And we know this is nothing new in our country's history. But we must pause right now and recognize those who live in fear every day because of who they are, and those who have lost their lives due to institutional and overt racism. And recognize, just a week ago, 6 Asian women killed in Georgia in a mass shooting action. So I would like to pause for a moment to recognize the lives we have lost to racism. And after that recognition, let me state once again that we will continue the work to expand the pursuit of justice, equity, and opportunity for all in every corner of our work. In fact, to fund the very services in our communities and our public education, we must continue to fight for revenue so that every student in California, a state that has the fifth largest economy in the world, has the resources for all students to be successful. Over the years, we at CFT have become experts at fighting for a fair piece of the pie when it comes to school funding. It is also true that the pie is proving to not be big enough to equitably provide the needs of everyone in our state. From the millionaire's tax to Prop 30 to Prop 15, CFT has long been a leader of the fight for more funding for our schools and colleges. Over the last 18 months, we fought hard to gather signatures for Prop 15, a long-planned effort to bring fairness to corporate property tax structure. While our first attempt to correct this injustice on the ballot this past November was not successful, our coalition of unions and community groups remains committed to the concept. And this is a fight that is far from over. We are continuing to work towards expanding the pie of the state's revenue in another way right now. Just 2 weeks ago, CFT proudly joined legislative leaders from throughout California to introduce the California Tax on Extreme Wealth. Yes, the first time introduced in California, a wealth tax, ACA 8. Sponsored by CFT, the legislation would implement a 1% tax on wealth in excess of $50 million per household in our state, and with an additional 0.5% on wealth in excess of $1 billion, to raise over $22 billion a year to fund our recovery and to rebuild our economy. Just cents for these billionaires. Go to our website now, and there is a prominent button to take action on the extreme wealth tax right now. California is home to some of the wealthiest people in the world, and it is unjust that they have not only survived, but thrived during the pandemic, raking in record profits while our most vulnerable communities have gone without resources and borne the brunt of this public health crisis. In fact, we have more billionaires in the state from just a year ago, while millions of Californians filed for unemployment. We will not stand idly by and allow this to go on without a fight, and CFT is once again prepared to take the lead in this righteous fight to correct a gross injustice, an inequity that exists. We are ready to be the first in the country to tax extreme wealth. Part of the fight for the long-term investment in our public schools is ensuring that new dollars are spent with an eye towards equity and justice in a way that shores up California's public education system to serve all of our all of our state's students in the decades to come. To that end, with your approval, CFT will also be rolling out a vision for the future of public education that highlights the priority that public education can and should be, so that as we rise out of the ashes and recover from COVID-19 pandemic, we will rebuild for a stronger future. Our public education system is resourced appropriately and with a strong enough foundation to take on the challenges we face ahead of us. A vision for public education that fully funds all of our public education systems. A vision that provides education from early childhood through a post-secondary degree with no debt. A vision that respects educators and classified professionals who reflect the diverse backgrounds of the students and communities. And a vision where students don't go hungry, aren't homeless, and do have their mental and physical health cared for. The CFT will prioritize this vision for the future of public education as the focus of our education policy work, both as we recover from COVID-19 pandemic and during the years to come, because California should be a leader in providing the best public education system in the country. And only by prioritizing students, educators, and classified professionals will this vision become a reality. And speaking of prioritizing educators and classified professionals, throughout this convention, you have and will continue to hear about our new identity. Please know this work is about more than a new logo or a new name. CFT is a union of educators and classified professionals. We all are CFT. Our new identity reflects our commitment to inclusivity and demarginalization. Our new identity embraces our diversity and highlights our commitment to valuing each other and standing together to successfully meet the challenges we are experiencing now and those that surely will come ahead. Our shield shows our strength and connects us to our national siblings and the affiliate AFT. Because we are stronger together, the work that we will pursue will be accomplished. I believe that the past year will make us stronger than ever before. Indeed, it already has. I believe that the trials that we have endured have caused us to reflect on who we are and we want to become. And it has given us this moment, however unasked for, to take bold actions, creating the future we can build together as we rise up, recover, and rebuild. We must rise up and defend our democracy, act on climate change, demand justice, and an end to systemic and institutional racism. We can recover from this pandemic and create safe spaces for ourselves and others. We will rebuild our education system with a bold vision for the future. We will rebuild our communities to embrace our individuality and our diversity. And we will rebuild and rebalance our society so that there is equity in our economy and an opportunity for all. And I know we can do this, and I know we will do this because we are united, because we are all CFT.